Mark, hi.
Hello, James. How are you?
Yeah, very, very well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing over there?
I'm good. You know, we're in the middle of summer here, so everything's like really warm and fuzzy, and I'm kind of the working year is just sort of kicking back into gear, and I'm like, oh, I have to actually make things again, and I was enjoying having holidays, so I'm fine.
We are as cold and as grey as it could be here, and I'm noticing myself on these Zooms that I am becoming pastier and pastier, so I'm long looking for spring. You are many things in your professional career, but primarily I was speaking to you today about your podcast, which is... It tickled me, the name, because I Stuff the British Stole is the title. And as a Brit, I immediately assumed this was a deep historical count from many moons ago about how terrible we once were. And as a Brit, I think I've put that aside and said modern Britain is nothing like that. Various bits in your series are quite recent.
Yes, very recent.
Not centuries, in fact, some of which are just decades ago, which is terrifying.
I want you to know I don't hold you personally responsible.
Thank you.
Does the rest of the colonised world. You're off the hook. It's okay.
As I was listening to it, I was thinking there must be a body of people who are not pleased with us generally as a populace.
I'll say this I think there's one thing that series did teach me is that there's two views of British colonialism that sort of dominate. There's one view which is, among certain people, which is like it was just a desecration of cultures and people around the world. And then there's another view which is, well, it's also the building blocks of our modern existence that we, a number of 40, 50 countries around the world simply wouldn't exist if it weren't for British colonialism. And here's the reality. They're both true. And there is a tendency when people talk about history to want to try and reconcile one with the other. Well, this is bad, but there was also this, or this was good, but then there's also this. And it's actually not how history works. And it's one of the things I learned from the series, which is that they don't cancel each other out. They don't balance each other out. They simply coexist. And a big thing I wanted to do with the series is using sort of the narrative of these objects is to actually drop you in the mess. So you have to come out the other side and go, wow, our history is messy. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway, and certainly the biggest thing that I've gotten from all the emails that have come out since the series has come out, is just people recognizing the fact that we're not, as blunt as the title is, the series itself is not. And I want people to feel the messiness and the conflicts in the history of any country that was touched by the British Empire, which is most
all of them.
At this point, pretty much, and even countries that weren't strictly speaking colonized. I mean, the third episode's about China, which is now our new superpower in effect, and seeing some of the knock-on effects of their interactions with the British Empire back in the day is really telling. And so I think what has surprised me about the success of the series has really been, if you can draw a line between an object that was taken many, many years ago and you got to pick an object that opens a door that helps you make sense of the world we have today. And if you can do that, the opportunities are endless with the series in terms of what it can be and what it says. And it's been actually, lovely, terrifying, occasionally quite funny to see how many doors those objects can open.
Are you a history buff?
No. I mean, this is the funny thing. Like, I'm a fraud in so many different ways. I don't have a university.
That's like me, podcast host. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. I mean, I have no university degree. I fell into media by being a film critic. From being a film critic, I ended up covering technology, and from there, I ended up becoming like a proper journalist, as they say. And I became a food journalist for a while, and I won some awards for that. And so what I am is a person that gets sucked into worlds. And I don't really belong anywhere as a journalist. So I tend to get sucked into cavernous worlds, and from that, I might make podcasts and documentaries. And so I like that I don't belong anywhere. I like that I don't look and feel like the average very serious journalist. I like that it buys me an opportunity to enter worlds I don't belong. And through that, I've had some pretty good experiences. So, yeah, no, the short answer to your question is no. I don't know anything about anything until I start making a project.
Right. I mean, so the depth of it is huge. Certainly, something that we're discovering along this journey of shows that we're putting together is that there are some people who make their shows on their own. Right? They will sit down. They will spend a year making it. They will write the audio. They'll compose the score. They'll edit it. They'll research it. They'll do the whole lot. You quite proudly talk about the fact in the show that you have a team, and that you have a co-producer, and a fairly extensive squad behind you. Looking after the assembly of it. You and your producer, what did the process look like when you were first putting the show together?
Well, it's actually not a very big team, realistically. Certainly not when you listen to the credits of some shows. So what it was is I came up with the idea talking to some friends, and then I happened to be on my way into London at the end of 2019. And I sort of knew it was a good idea, so I packed my recording equipment, and I was actually in London for an award that I knew I was going to lose to the BBC. So I was like, I'm going to make this trip worthwhile. And so I booked some interviews with people who I knew had been covering this stuff. And so I did that all on my own, and I actually ended up pitching the series to a whole bunch of people, different organisations that I knew, and a lot of them were like, and I just kind of got a neither here nor there. And I happened to do a radio show at the ABC in Australia, which is our version of the BBC. And I casually mentioned it to my boss. And she's like, "Oh, that's fantastic." And she's actually English. She's like, "Oh, that's fantastic. You should do that for us." And I'm like, okay. And so that's when Zoe Ferguson, the producer, came on board, and she and I worked together on finding the characters that we wanted. And around about that point, the pandemic was kicking off, so we knew we were going to have to do a lot of it remotely, and so there was a lot of time that went into stringers and remote records. But the irony is that just as we were finishing the interviews, Zoe got a job at another organisation. So I wrote the series, I cut the series, I did the first mix of the series, and then Marty came on to do the final mix. And so that really was the team, in effect. So it's sort of two and a half of us, and then Amrutha, the executive producer, kind of helped with the final stages. So I think it sounds bigger than it is, but most people don't realize is most of the time you're making a series like this, and certainly I've done 2 series for Audible in the US. 90% of the time, it is me by myself out in a random location with a microphone, holding a microphone in someone's face and asking them to tell me their life story. And I think having worked in both television and radio for a long time, I love the simplicity and the elegance of audio, because you can just stand in front of a person and there's no artifice, or there's very little artifice, and it's very easy to forget that a microphone is there after a while. And I think you get incredible things from people. This time was complicated because we had to do remote record setups, but I think what I'm most looking for is particularly when we're putting together the series, is to do everything you can to remove that artifice so that the listening experience for the listener, they feel like they're there with the character. That's really important to me, no matter what I'm making. So it's smaller and simpler than I think it sounds sometimes, in terms of how we put this stuff together.
You're forgetting the whole bit that once you've finished, who's distributing it and socialing it and all of those bits. That's true. I did all these animated videos for it because I just like making that stuff. But I was really lucky that the ABC have this incredible digital reporter by the name of Nick Wiggins, and actually I was quite surprised because when I first started doing the edits of it, they were listening to it and they were like, "This is great. We're going to do articles about it." And I'm like, "Cool. You want to do 1 or 2?" And they're like, "We want to do one for every one." I was like, "Every episode?" I was like, "Oh, okay." And so I think I was actually taken aback by how supportive they were. That sounds terrible. And yeah, so the ABC were great about getting articles made. And at the same time, because I come from a joint sort of TV, radio background, I went off and I just produced up videos and stuff like that I thought would help kind of draw people into the world. And I guess that's all part of I like to do a lot of stuff myself. Instinct. Yeah, I get that. The audio point you make is really interesting. The studios we build here are very much designed for visual, even though we call them podcast studios. because I see that as a very obvious emergence of where that side of things is going.
Definitely.
The more people we have in, lots of people are still doing just audio. And you've just raised a really interesting point, especially with your subject matter. You are quite artistic, presumably, in your general life. I'd imagine you can draw.
I try.
I don't. Yeah.
Sure.
But the audio, when I was listening to it, it forces you to paint your own picture, right? You talk about, you just spoke about the Chinese episode, so I can call that not a spoiler. And you talk about describing these gardens and the opulence that goes through them and all that sort of thing, and it forces you to paint. Because you're not watching it in your head, it forces you to try and visualize what that sort of stuff would look like. And I never really thought about it until you just click that together, where actually there is a really interesting side of saying audio on its own can paint very visual stories without having to have the pictures go with them.
Definitely. I think in some ways, I actually think podcasting is the most visual medium there is, because what you're playing with is your words, the sound, the soundtrack, and then the sort of the key ingredient is the imagination and the baggage that the listener brings to the party. And that's a really powerful thing to wrangle, right? Because one of the things that I was quite intent on doing at the beginning of every episode of Stuff the British Style is leveraging what you don't know. So if for those of you that have heard the final episode of season 1, it takes place on a beach, and I don't reveal. I'm very careful at what I reveal, what's happening on this beach, and then I ultimately reveal where we are, what's happening, and it's actually a very key moment in the history of Australia, but I don't reveal that. Now that's actually a really hard thing to do in television, because you in television there is a requirement that eventually you give a sense of space and location, and what was important to me was playing with what the audience don't know and what their imagination of where they are, and then gradually feeding them enough information to complete the image in their head, and then the actual revelation of where they are and what's going on is a powerful tool. And everything in Brit Style, sorry, that's my nickname for the series, Brit Style. Everything in the series has to be a revelation or a hook. So everything's got to create a curiosity gap. I think of it as a curiosity gap. And when you go meet a person, there needs to be like an information deficit driving you to meet that person. Like, I don't know this, but I need to understand this. So-and-so will be able to answer my question. And then when you reach the end of that character in the podcast, you've got to be like, oh, I learned this from blah, blah, but now I need to know blah, blah. And that propels you onwards. And so it's actually like curiosity gap is like it creates a vacuum that sucks the listener through to the next character. And that's how you sort of structure it. And podcasting is good because if you're playing with people's imagination, there's so many things you can do to kind of build up that image in people's minds. And I like, one of the reasons why I did the editing on this season, on this series and the music is I like being able to experiment with what particular combination of sound effects and music and scripting will get that image in people's mind. It's actually one of the most fun parts of my job, being a person that makes things, is actually understanding that you're playing with people's imagination at all times.
How when you're doing this and you're talking about people creating this themselves, presumably the audience interaction that's followed with the show must be pretty unique. You don't really get that in TV in the same way, because you must have literal questions that people are asking, as well as statements about, oh my god, can you believe this? And you're very memeable, right? Like the little headlines that you can grab are quite memeable.
Well, I think one thing that's really good about podcasting is that it's highly resistant to live tweeting, right? So people tend to have to consume it in its entirety before they say something about it on social. So mostly what people will say is, on social, they'll share it after they've heard the whole thing. If it were on television or it was on a medium where people could second screen, I feel like there'd be a lot more people, tweeting midway through, not realizing where we're taking them. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I love that about television. But I do like that there's something about the medium where people tend to consume it in its entirety before they form an opinion on it, which actually, when you think about, the state of media in the world at the moment, it's actually quite rare. And in some ways it makes podcasting a really special place because you can still do that. I mean, it's really podcasts and movies in cinemas where people have to do that now. There's not a lot of other mediums out there where people don't form their opinion 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, and insist on telling the rest of the world. So I think there's something powerful about that is worth preserving.
Do you think that's why you talk about being able to leech people along this journey and suck from section to section? You talk about the last one, especially where there's the big reveal as you eventually work out where you are. That's not possible in TV. Doesn't really work on any format, really, because of what you're saying. People are gonna, if they were watching it in a half hour or 40-minute TV show, 10 minutes in, someone's gonna tweet, "I know where he is. I've been on that beach," or I recognise that little, that sort of thing. I mean, it's interesting because talking to you obviously are you are part of, or the show is put out by the National Broadcasting Corporation, effectively, ABC, right? And yet you sound completely like a personal podcaster. Do you know what I mean? You don't sound like you've been corporation whacked. You don't sound no, we've got our editors. Thank you very much, Mark. You've done your bit. Thanks for the audio. We'll deal with it from here. None of that.
I think I'm used to dealing with, because I've had a very non-traditional entry into the world of journalism, I've become quite used to doing things in my own voice. And I think it's important to note that the underlying principles of journalism remain the same. Like, we still fact check things. We still make sure we're being fair and balanced. Like, none of that has changed. But none of those important pillars of journalism prevent you from having a unique voice. Do you know what I mean? Like, none of those pillars and that institutional voice should ever stop you from being unique. And indeed, because I never came up through traditional newsrooms, I have never actually had an opportunity to adopt that voice. So I've hosted a national current affairs program for the ABC, not for the ABC, for SBS, one of our other broadcasters, for about 8 years now. And I think one of the things I like most about the work I get to do is I still get to be me while still doing my job. And I think the more unique voice you can be, I mean, you don't want to be like contrarian or like unique for the sake of it, but the more recognizably you are, the more people sort of understand where you're coming from. And I think that's a positive attribute. I guess it's something that I think it's to be used. And one thing that I think podcasting resists as a medium is homogenous voices. It as a medium, because it is so intimate, and I know it gets said so often about podcasting, you put your headphones in and you're in somebody else's mind, and every podcaster loves to say that stuff, but it's true. And I think if you're going to exist in some person's imagination and some person's mind, you have to give them all these, clues as to who you are and what's driving you and your personality. And if you're just a voice of God, newsreader, you're giving them very little to latch onto. I did a series for Audible a couple of years ago called It Burns. And actually, that's the thing that was nominated for the award that I was going to lose to the BBC. And one of the first things...
What did you lose to? Do you remember?
I lost to... what's the World Service podcast about the Apollo 11 project? 13 Minutes to the Moon.
Yeah.
It Burns was nominated for the Rose d'Or, and we lost to 13 Minutes to the Moon. But one thing that when I was starting on that series, the first thing the producer said to me is like, well, why do you care about this story? Like what? And he's like, you have to understand the first character in your podcast is you. Right? Now, that doesn't mean you have to make everything about you, but at some point the audience need to understand why you are doing this. And you need to be able to, and there are variably artful ways of conveying that without sucking focus away from the topic, right? So the audience got to have some understanding of why, not just why you, but why should they go on this journey with you for the next, 8 episodes or however many it is. So I think that's an important sort of understanding that you are yourself a character. And indeed, like when we're working on scripts for these series, often the producers always find this, that I work with, always find this hilarious, that I start talking about the Marc on the script as though he's a separate person that doesn't know shit, because he doesn't. He has to learn that stuff across the series. And he's like, I start referring to him in the third person, and they're like, that's really weird that you do that. I'm like, it is. Good point. But it's helpful.
My overindulgent past 20 years where I've referred to myself in the third person are now becoming super useful.
Finally, it's come good.
Yeah, great. Have you got a different audience spread with the pods to what you... I mean, obviously you work on a national TV, current affairs. I presume no one's watching that outside of Australia. I don't mean that disparagingly. I mean, like...
It's fine. No. It is interesting. The show that I do, The Feed, does really well on YouTube. So it does... But that's not like a dedicated following. That's an opportunistic YouTube algorithm following. The 2 series I did for Audible did really well in the US. So they have a mostly American listenership, plus they take place in America. What's been interesting about Stuff the British Stole, because it's out in the open podcast ecosystem and because it touches on so many countries, is I've been getting emails from so many different countries. So obviously I get tons of emails from people in the UK who've been to museums and be like, where did that come from? Can you find out for me? I was about to do the accent and I promised myself I was not going to do the accent.
You did it well when you did your producer's voice. When you talked about the British lady you work with.
So many British people, and I fall into an accent, and it's always embarrassing. It's not that I'm bad at it; it's just that I do it so readily. And the worst part is when I'm in another country, particularly the US or the UK, I just adopt the accent. Like particularly in America, where there are parts of it where if you're not rolling your R's, they have no idea what you're talking about. And then when of course you're doing it for work and you're recording an interview, you actually have to remember like, go back to your original accent because otherwise it won't be consistent with the rest of the voice. Little silly things that I do. But I've totally lost my track of what I was supposed to be answering.
We were talking about when you did the shows with Audible, they got different reach. And when you were here, when you did this one, you got reach from all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, Stuff the British Stole, I must say, like it's been, it's clearly touched a nerve, I guess, in a good way. I think the response and the emails I've gotten from people around the world have been really remarkable. And I must say, I've done a lot of stuff that's done quite well on places like YouTube over the years, but this is a different thing because I feel like people feel like they know me now, and it's been quite something quite different for me, I must say.
It seems like an opportune moment for me to plug my corporate overlords.
Do that
with the algorithm that the guys at Podicon have created. I understand you don't know really much about your stats from the pod board.
No.
You are certainly a standout performer on the pod board. For those listening for the first time who are catching this on the back of Marc being Marc rather than Podboard being Podboard, the Podicon Podboard 100 is a metric that is created to try and understand a bit more about podcasts and their real success. So aside from the download stats, and they have a big concern about legacy downloads forming a part of those numbers, it takes into consideration things like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, social interactions around the hashtags to do with the things you're talking about at the times those shows are being listened to, and a whole load of other complicated stuff that frankly I leave to the computer geniuses that are sitting at the other end. However, you are the number one Australian history pod of 2020, period.
Cool.
On the Podboard 100.
Thank you.
Which is like I said to you when we were speaking pre-interview, even for dailies and regular series and all of that, there was what was there, 6 or 7 in the first one?
I think there's 5 episodes plus an episode 0, so
plus,
in effect 6.
Plus, 6. And when did it first release?
I think November 15, so quite late in the year.
Right. November 2015?
No, sorry, the November 2020.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I was just like, it was the 15th of November that the episode 0.
Right.
I don't know why anybody else other than me wants to know that.
So basically, in a month and a half, it became the annual top Aussie history pod, which is
Cool.
incredible. You haven't yet left the Podball 100 charts, which for a series, again, is certainly a short series, is crazy unique. It was number 1 on 7 separate occasions across all genres in Australia, which is solid considering it's a month and a half old. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole peppering of them here, which I'll get the guys to send to you afterwards because they're nice to have, even if you just keep them in your pocket. But that whole process of coming up with the first series, you keep saying the first series.
Yeah.
What's next?
Well, we are going to do a second series of it. That's a given. What
is it stuff that someone else stole, or
no,
is it still us? We're still rape and pillaging around the world. Great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot of history to work through there, but I think, look, the main thing, we are working through a bunch of objects at the moment, and as a brand, we might do some other things with it as well. It might grow beyond podcasting. We're still sort of working at some of that sort of stuff. But definitely we're doing another series. And at the moment, we've got about 50 or so objects that we're looking at. I'm a big fan of the shorter series, making sure the episodes you're picking really tell something great. I think the bar it needs to be clear each object, because there's obviously like thousands of things that have been taken over the years, but the bar it needs to be cleared is this: the object has to have a good, what I call macro story, so lots of twists and turns and things, and with great characters who you sort of want to listen to. But the most important thing is this: is that object and the story that it unfolds has to tell you something about the world that we have today. It has to link back to something in the mind of the listener who goes, "Oh my God, that affects something about my life, no matter where I am." And I think that's the key to the series. That's the DNA of it. And the toolkit we use to arrive at that can change. It can grow. We can do it in a different way. But that's the heart of it. It's got to be, does this object open up a doorway into something that makes sense of the world we have today? And that's sort of what we're looking for at the moment. And we're also looking at doing, one of the things I resisted doing in the first season was the really big things, like the Elgin marbles and the Kohinoor diamond that sits in the crown jewels. And now I think we might actually look at tackling some of those big items. And the question is there a way, because there's been books and documentaries that have been done about those objects. The question for me is, how do you tell that story in a way that adds value, that tells you something you don't know? And that's the sort of the question that I have, that, you only really get an answer when you find characters. When you find characters that can tell you something or show you something that you've never seen before, that's when you know that you have something that feels different and fresh that you can add to the mix.
But isn't that a testament to, you're never going to say no to this, to your style, in that you were talking, you're documenting things and that have one way or another been told 1,000 times before, right? Like there's a wealth of resource to be able to research these things. If you were a real history buff, you could sit with each of your episodes and delve way deep into an exploratory of, there's masses of information out there. So presumably all you've got to do is connect those dots in this romantic arc that enables you to connect something that happened decades or centuries ago to your present day. How do you even start? Like you start with a specific object, you talked about that, and then you talk in the podcast about reaching out to people. What does that journey look like for discovery? Because obviously there's a lot of people here or who will be listening to this that think podcasts are chat shows, or they are, long form interview shows, and that's all they do. And lots of people at various points on their podcast journey, depending on how they got in, get awakened to the idea that there's this whole world of podcasts that isn't just whatever the form is they first got into. And obviously the chat show style, you and I are going to have this conversation. We could put this out this afternoon, right? There's no way you could do that. you have
Right.
extensive research. That whole journey arc, how long do you think it extends, or is it infinite because you wait until you find the right hook to bring it onto that arc?
It shouldn't be infinite. I will say that there are various different ideas for podcasts and documentary series that I've been sort of sitting on and adding to for years, and I just wait for the right moment where there's the right commissioner or the right character. But in terms of specifically Brit style, it really comes down to characters, right? So when you latch onto, and I actually think this is true of most of the series that I work on, when I find the character that I want to, that gets me to the heart of the issue, or launches me into the issue, or complicates the issue, that's when it all starts falling into place. So you find the person for whom will set up why the object matters, and then you look around them to find the people who have been supporting them and bolstering them, or have a diametrically opposed view to them, and why did they think that about that, and what's their motivation. And so to me, it's a story built up of people. So actually what that involves is really just emailing and calling a lot of people. And that's how all of the series that I've worked on. I remember when we made It Burns, the first series I did for Audible, I actually sat in this studio and I spoke to a guy in the US, and that series is about the race to breed the world's hottest chili. And I spoke to him for an hour and a half, and he was just telling me how he thought the Guinness World Record was a fraud and something terrible had happened, and this world record had been stolen, and he took it so seriously. And I remember hanging up the phone call and went, all right, there's a series there. Because I knew that I'd met the character who would start it. And from there, everything would flow. And it's the same with Britstol. When you find the person who is compelling enough to bring you into the world, pretty soon, they create like a gravity well. Pretty soon you start to find the other people, the other points of view, the other perspectives that will help, disagree, and disagreement provides you conflict, which shifts you forward. So eventually you start finding all the bits, but it starts with people. And when you find the people, the story follows.
Do you think you learnt that, or do you think you've got that? Because you talk about it so fluidly.
It's learnt. It's a totally learnt thing that I've nothing. I joke that I'm a fraud, but it is actually true to an extent that everything I know about podcasting and journalism and producing, it's been a bit of a sort of trial and error situation, and a lot of it, because I come from a background of producing and editing my own work, I spend a lot of time watching my own shit, things where I'm I've really messed this up, and luckily nobody else has to watch. I have to fix this in my own edit. I'm not
before anyone else sees it.
yeah, and I think that's actually a really good thing for all, certainly TV and radio presenters to do, is you learn to edit your own stuff so you're not subjecting other people to your garbage. And I hate subjecting other people to my garbage. I'd rather make something, learn what I've done is good or bad, and invest more in the things that worked, and hopefully nobody ever sees the things that were shit. And so it's all trial and error. And I guess because I do make a lot of stuff, I have this opportunity to put things out in the world and experience the joys and pain of feedback from the audience around the world, which is, can be really overwhelming at times. I don't know if you've ever seen, but on Audible, they have a really active audience reviewer kind of mechanism. And I remember when Nut Jobs, the second series I did, it had over 10,000 written reviews from Audible listeners, particularly in the US. And I remember after around the first 3,000 audience reviews, I was like, I'm tapping out, because I would just log in the morning and read all the reviews from the listeners. I was like, 10,000 reviews, written reviews, too many for me to read.
Yeah.
And it was really positive, and some people absolutely hated this one aspect, but they loved this. And I was like, I need to I've made it. I put it out in the world. I'm going to go and make something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not changing, and it's not something I'm doing iteratively where I'm, making a new episode every week. It's done. It's out. And now I move on to the next project. And as with all aspects of, when you live your life in public and you're making things in the public eye, you have to accept that some people are going to love something and some people are going to think that you're worse than Hitler, and that's just the reality.
I was going to say, surely, especially with your level of general exposure, you can't hear any of it, can you? Like, nobody likes everything all of the time. It's not possible.
No. And I don't think I have I don't have a terrible... I have a reasonably positive relationship with the people that consume my stuff. I hate saying the public because it sounds like it's a monolithic. Like, people that consume the stuff that I make. If you could
then stand there, hold your hands up and say, the people, that would be much better.
Yeah. I mean, in part why I'm uncomfortable with it as a phrase is because one thing you get taught in broadcasting is you're never broadcasting to a group. You're always talking to one person. And so I always visualize it in that sense. But like you have to accept that, like, some people think you're like the worst thing ever. That's okay. But it was actually the thousands of people writing detailed reviews about something that I'd spent a year of my life making, I realized was like super interesting to read for the first couple of days. And then I was like, you need to like a departure from that. And even if it's lovely, like, the reviews of stuff certainly on Apple in particular, the reviews of stuff, the British style, are like glowing, except for like a handful of people.
Angry Brits.
Yeah, I mean, I think the angriest sort of stuff you get is, well, why haven't you done Portugal and Hungary and all these all these other countries? And I'm like, we may well.
We'll get there. But now we won't. Now they are way down the list because you were so mean about it.
Well, I think, look, it was always originally my plan that you would do like stuff the French style, stuff the German style. You'd do that in time. But the reality of the situation is that the British Empire exerts a degree of power over history that is unlike anything else. Like, you'd have to go back to the Roman Empire to do one cultural group that have exerted so much influence around the world. And what we have now is a world where the tendrils of what was happening in the 17th, 18th, 19th century still exist, and the people that can talk about them are still alive. So I think Britain, because of its position in modern history, is perfect for it, because it really, our world as it exists today simply just wouldn't exist if it weren't for those years of colonial expansion, be it good or bad. So I think it is in some ways it is unique. Like, it is a unique nation for its impact, and also for sort of what's happened in the days after sort of World War II, and how Britain itself has changed shape, and what it looks like and what it feels like and its attitudes have really drastically changed as well. And what was really interesting, and what has been really interesting talking to people in the UK, is seeing how people in the UK are reckoning with that history. Like, when we were making Stuff the British Style was also around about the time all those statues started to get pulled down around the country. And, and it was really interesting because, like, we were looking at each other just being like, why can't the series be out now? And I was like, this is good because it says, and there was a really lively debate. And there should be a lively debate about whether that actually is the right way to deal with the nastier parts of the UK's history. And I don't think I don't feel comfortable saying, well, we should definitely pull them all down, or we should definitely just leave them up and replace the plaques, because each one of those objects, each one of those statues has its own world of history attached to it. And I think they need to be dealt on a case-by-case basis. But that's me. It's not my country, I guess.
I have a view where these things that were, and now they are stand as relics, and whether they turn from time as being celebrated relics into disgusted ones, they still serve as a reminder of the fact that they existed. And I thought that lots of these things getting pulled down, they actually mean that those people are going to disappear from history. And if they disappear from history, then the lessons we're supposed to have learnt from those awful people, or now awful people, it's not sitting there reminding us that at one point in society they were celebrated, and we should be careful about who we celebrate now, because in 100 years' time, those damn TV presenters, they'll pull those statues down quicker than you can imagine, right? Like, you never know. I think that's what history is. I'm not a history buff either, by the way. I'm interested.
No, but I think there's an interesting point to be had about, and actually one of the things I realized when I was making it was was how inanimate objects are a really dangerous way to mark history, because they don't move and they don't change. You build them once and they are a monument that is designed to exist forever and to be unchanging. But actually, history, as we know, is a pretty fluid, messy thing, and impressions of it change over time, and facts about those events are unveiled over time. So even though what happened, what we know about what happened, what we say about what happened, that itself grows and changes, which is why I love this medium, because the beauty of something like a podcast is that you can actually encapsulate that nuance. You can actually, you can sort of, what am I saying here? You can encapsulate that nuance, and you can take the audience on that journey in a way that is a lot harder with an inanimate object. And I think that's one of those interesting distinctions that we really sort of saw a lot of people grappling with, particularly in the last year, being like, maybe these objects, maybe building monuments to the past is setting ourselves up for a really difficult decision down the track, where we have to reconcile whether that actually does mean what we want it to mean in 2035 or whenever it is it comes next. And maybe that's not the best way for us to tell our own stories.
Do you think that with the internet, this period of reconciliation has become infinitely shorter? I feel like the stuff you talk about took hundreds of years to propagate and turn into a story. And now you're talking about things like, look at the raid on the Capitol the other day, right, in Washington. 2 days later, that was a bad idea, right? Like do you know what I mean? Like, they didn't even have time to make the statue of the horn dude. Like, they turned him into an icon and destroyed him in a 3-day period. Like, does that
he probably
legacy
contributed to
exist
that
anymore?
just a little bit himself.
Yeah.
Look, I think I don't know that the internet is the internet almost has the opposite problem. Like, it almost moves too fast that we never have time to fully process an idea. And again, one of the things I like about this medium is that it actually, its pace, its rhythm, its heartbeat is really methodical. Like, it has to flow at a certain rhythm to feel like you're beating through the story at a certain pace, and hopefully the heartbeat of the series and the heartbeat of the listener start to sync up if you're doing it well, if they're on board for the journey. Whereas sometimes I find the internet moves too fast and I don't feel like I can get a handle on the stories as they're unfolding. And, if you go back in the other direction, there are aspects of history that and our understanding of history that simply in certain places has not moved fast enough. So, I like this. Maybe it makes sense that I've gravitated towards this medium because it feels like it unfolds at a pace that I can digest.
Also, it's there now. It's there forever, right? So there are going to be resurgences of people listening to that show. Presumably, when season 2 comes out, you get a massive re-listen of people coming back for season 1. Would you revisit any of the ideas that you spoke to already if somebody bought you something that was like, oh my God, that wasn't what that was at all? Or is it done? That
definitely.
was the story as it was then?
No. I mean, it would depend what it is. I've never been a huge fan of sort of bonus episodes and addendums, but I think if something, only because like those are the episodes I, as a listener, always skip. That's the only reason. It's not that I don't think they're valid. It's just like, they're the things that I'm like, man, I'm not going to listen to that one. I'm going to listen to a new episode.
Yeah.
So that's just me being a dickhead. If something major was unveiled that drastically reshapes an episode, I would look at going back and either adding something or reposting it with some new edits, like that kind of stuff. I would definitely be open to doing, for sure.
So this is going to be a bombshell for you. You're not going to believe what happened.
It's too late in the day. Don't do that to me.
No, clearly just messing. You were talking about you were talking about the pace. Just before I go on to, I want to talk about you. You were talking about home studio, but the pace. I found the pace of your of Brits. It's a very anxious set of subjects, right? It's very stressful, but a very relaxing listen. Like, I was quite happy sitting and listening to it. I listen to a lot of pods on the move while I'm while I'm doing stuff. I was quite happy to sit and listen to yours like I was reading a book almost, rather than, I don't know what that says about the pacing or whether that was a required effect, but there's my
The trick is to have muscle relaxants before you sit in front of the microphone.
And then you just can't move it at all.
No.
So 2 cups of coffee while I've been sitting here probably isn't the one.
Yeah. You finish a quart of gin and then you do all your voices. Well, I naturally speak quite fast.
Yeah.
And so, but when I like to tell a story and I'm interested in telling a story, I tend to be quite methodical with how I do it. And do you know what it is? It's having kids. Having to read bedtime stories to my kids has given me an appreciation for really being in the story when you narrate a story. So and also like really writing into the tape, into the audio that you have. So as much as possible, you're letting the interviews that you have, let them push the story forward, and only ever use as much of your own voice as you need to. So, like the thing you were saying before about, I'm doing a bad example of it now because now I'm just like rabbiting on and talking like a moron. But I think one of the things when I'm describing places and trying to put people in a place, the goal is, can I build as complete an image in people's mind with my words with the fewest number of concepts? It's not about the fewest number of words, but it's the fewest number of concepts. So what is the shortest digestible idea that can get this person in that headspace? And, and there are brilliant examples of this, like really good writers like your Oscar Wildes were really good at this sort of stuff. And I'm by no means suggesting that I'm as good at it as them. But I just found it's not, often you'd get told like use the fewest number of words. And I think it's not about words. It's about like how quickly can a singular idea get you to understand a character, or how quickly can a singular idea get you to understand a place. So that's sort of the way I look at it, and that, I found that an easier way of writing and recording narration for series like this.
Okay, so let's do some nerdy podcaster questions. When you go on your travels and you're grabbing all your gear, what's in hand?
Okay, so I use a Zoom H5 little recordery thing, and that plugs into a Sennheiser shotgun mic, which I've got on a little sort of holder. And the reason I use a shotgun mic is because the vast majority of what I make is field recording. So it burns, nut jobs, stuff the British stole. They're all out in the world. You're interviewing people inside of freeways and in the middle of, crops and forests. You're out, and I like having a shotgun because it gives me really clear voice and just the right amount of like outside world in the background. And it works, it works in different places. The only thing I've found it is slightly awkward is in the US, from a distance, it does look very much like a gun. And I've had people like on like the side of highways.
You need a bright yellow foam to go on top.
Exactly.
That's
so I've had like
interesting
security
problem.
guards. It's only because I was doing some stuff where security guards weren't a fan of me in a certain part of the US, and they would always like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm recording a radio interview from Australia. I'm innocent." And I realized how intimidating I probably looked with this thing to them. So look, and I sometimes put a sock on it, sometimes don't, but that's what I use when I'm out and about. So I use a Sennheiser.
And headphones?
Oh, yeah, definitely headphones. In fact, me recording this interview right now, not having cans on, is making me very nervous. This is why I keep looking up at the waveform to make sure it's all.
What are your what's your headphones of choice?
Oh God, I have so many. I've got a Bose set of headphones, and I've got an AKG set of headphones. Those are my. Yeah, those are my two. So the Boses, I think those ones you've got there. Are those Boses on you?
Yeah, these are quiet comforts.
I've got a set of those, and I've got a set of AKGs. And the only reason I use the AKGs is because the wire is thicker and therefore doesn't get tangled as much. Those are the two ones I use. I think you need cans that have pretty good coverage because you need to get a sense of what your Atmos is actually going to sound like. So I'm pretty anal about recording Atmos tracks and sort of getting lots and lots of dedicated sound effects when you're out and about in the world.
I was going to ask you about that because your museum recordings, it almost sounds like you've done a ambient mix before you've shot the thing and you've laid it over the interview. It sounds so much like you're standing in a museum. Is that what you do? Well,
I did collect a bunch of museum Atmos when I was in London, just because I was there and I had it and I could do it. I think, and you do, because I'm so used to making it stuff, I sort of know that when you're building a soundscape, you're actually building an entire world out of what I call audio close-ups. So in order to do that, I had a sequence in Nut Jobs, for example, where I was on the top of the Sequoia Mountains, and I had to kind of explain that climate change was stopping these trees from building up rivers down below. And so in order to tell that story, I needed the sound of the birds, I needed the sound of wind rustling through the trees, I needed the sound of my footsteps, I needed the sound of the water trickling down the thing. I then needed to go further down the river to get the sound of the audio of the water gushing because now the snow was melting. You need all those close-ups. Close-ups is what I call them.
Yeah,
in order to
great descriptive.
To build the narrative, right? Because you have to be able to take people on a linear journey from it starts here to here to here. And what you want to be able to do is tell your story as you would tell it to a friend, which is how your relationship with the listener should be, and then have all the elements ready to, underneath and around to support your listener through that journey. And it's just, and if you start thinking about them as isolated elements and you've got your raw Atmos, you can make that journey seem as long or as short as you need it to, but you have to get the elements in order to do it.
Yeah. I like that description. It's a good description. Those close-ups. It's a clever way of looking at it. So before we started the interview, you were talking about your home recording studio. You're a big content guy, so presumably there's some thought going into this eventually. I'm not saying you have already. Are you building a studio? What's going on at home?
It's when the pandemic first started, my son, who is 6, and I decided we would build Daddy a studio space. So I bought I also wasn't sure if I was going to actually have to end up doing my radio show from home. So with all these sort of considerations, and I'd like to get to a point where I can do most of what I do without having to impinge on a network's resources if I don't have to. So if I want to do voiceovers, I'll just do them from home. And so I went off and I bought one of those Rode Podcaster Pro desks, which I love.
Are excellent.
Yeah, they're brilliant. And my son loves just playing with the sound effects.
Yeah, I've got a 6-year-old who does exactly the same game.
Yeah. we got in the habit of he would pick a storybook. We would go through freesound.org, pick out sound effects and music, load it up in the board, and then I would read the story and he would fire the sound effects. And my wife also works as a radio producer as well. So I think we've got.
I was going to say this sounds like a sweet dad story. Actually, you're training staff is what you're really doing. Exactly,
exploitation begins at home.
There's a tagline for the interview.
What we did is I bought that, and I bought the same microphones that we use at my studio at the ABC. So these are Neumanns.
Yeah.
And they are I just love the sound of them. They're rich and they're warm, And because when I start talking really fast, I get quite high pitched and nasal, and I really hate that sound. And the Neumanns really emphasize the back, like the deeper end of the voice, which is actually what my voice needs, because I'm a lot of variation. I can be quite low, and then when I get going, I'm up here, and it's quite annoying. So anything that kind of pulls you into the deeper end of the spectrum is better for me. So I use the Neumanns for that. And I got one of the Rode stands, which we built into the desk. And I already had Pro Tools and Premiere and all that sort of stuff, had a separate monitor put in, and we put some sound. And I have this like sort of tiny closet-sized office that when we first moved into the house, we sort of looked at it and went, it looks like it looked like a glorified wardrobe. It's not very big. And I looked at it and went, it's perfect. It's exactly what I need. I don't want any bigger than that. It's exactly.
And I don't want the sound coming in. Leave me alone.
Exactly. So, and what my son and I did was, we bought a bunch of soundproofing from the hardware store, and we stuck it to all the walls with double-sided tape that when I eventually have to take them off, will leave so much damage on those walls. But so it goes.
That's why it's only a small closet room, so that it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. In fact, a friend of mine was asking if we were interested in selling our house because he's a television editor. And I was like, you should move into our house. It already has an editing bay.
And he was like, I don't think you understand what I need.
No, I don't think. He was very polite.
Yeah. Look, thank you. I think we've covered the bases. I'm mindful of going so deep when I know that season 2 is on the horizon, and we're probably going to get the opportunity to do this again real shortly. Do we have a date on that? Do you know when that's coming?
It won't be till midway through this year, so we've got a bit of time.
So long. Look, I really appreciate your time, and it's been really interesting getting into your head a bit about what went into actually creating the series. The series, by the way, is Stuff the British Stole, which is available everywhere, right? I mean, you can literally get it anywhere. There's a load of cool snippet videos as well if you look around in the right places on YouTube.
Mostly on my Instagram. That's how I.
Is that where you post it?
Yeah, because it's probably where the YouTube and Instagram and Twitter is where I posted most of that stuff, and we'll definitely be doing more of those teasers and clips for the second series for sure.
Great. Thank you. Really good to meet you. And I'm sure that everyone has got a better insight now into what went into making what is definitely a great show. The chart numbers again, just so that we can finish it with a big smile. You were number 1 Australian History Pod of 2020 in Australia. A month after the episode was released, Stuff the British Stole has still not left the Podball 100 charts. And it was number 1 on 7 separate occasions across all genres in Australia. So massively high accolades, and thank you for speaking to me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. I hope we speak again soon.